Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Paul Schreier, the Research Director of ESCoE, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on water accounting. Now, the management of natural capital, of course, starts with measurement and monitoring, and water is undeniably one of the most basic natural assets that we have. And while there's a lot of data on water around, actually systematic water accounting is not that widespread if you look around in various countries, despite its importance for policy and analysis. So I'm very pleased that we have this seminar, this webinar today, and I would like to welcome our presenters, starting with Paul Ekins, who is a professor of resources and environmental policy at UCL's Institute for Sustainable Resources, and Joe Grice, who is an honorary professor at UCL as well, and also a visiting professor at King's College London. He was a previous chief economist at the ONS and a treasurer, and has been working on natural capital for quite some time now. I also would like to welcome Ian Dickey, who is our discussant. He's the director of FTech and Environmental Economy Consultancy. And he too has worked on methods for the UK natural capital accounts that were produced by the ONS, but also more internationally for Eurostat's work on ecosystem accounting. In today's webinar, Joe and Paul will present for about 40 minutes. Ian will then deliver some comments for about 5 to 10 minutes, and normally that works out for some questions and answers in the end. Normally we conclude the meeting after 1 hour's time. So without further ado, let me turn to Joe and Paul for their presentation. Over to you, Joe. I think you will start.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Paul. That's a very nice introduction to what we think this webinar is about, which is basically the scope and some of the issues and problems that we've encountered in what's an ESCoE project, essentially to develop and compile SEEA-related, SEEA-consistent accounts with the UK. I'll talk about SEEA a bit in a moment. I should say that while Paul and I have both been co-leading this work, actually a huge amount of work has been done by the team, the collaborative team. We've been working on this, particularly Alice Bartolini, Silvia Farini, Vittorio Reyes, and also Martin Wheel, that actually has been involved in the work as well. So this is very much joint. We wouldn't have been able to proceed with that work. And the next slide, please. And again, I think next slide. I just want to say a bit about no, one back, please. International guidance slide, please. That's it. Now, the international guidance now available. It's particularly opportune time to be doing this work. To is the system of environmental economic accounts, UN promulgated, essentially to govern the accounting interactions between the environment and the economy. The SEEA-EA, System of Environmental Accounts Economic Services, was promulgated in 2091. It's slightly different in scope in many ways from the SNA, the System of National Accounts, which isn't required to underpin national accounting. Because the SNA was initially set up because a number of national accounts were available in various countries, and there was a perceived need to ensure consistency and coherence. With the SEEA, we have an international code, but actually, as I think you were referring to, Paul Schreier, there's actually very few examples of compiled national accounts around. So it's a slightly odd situation that we're in, and it's not easy to find very developed accounts in other countries from which we can learn enormously. The other key development on the international side is that the 2024 revision of the system of national accounts itself, the SEEA, change in concentrating on net concepts rather than gross concepts, or at least as well as gross concepts. So it opens up the possibility of articulated national environmental accounts, in which it's possible to say, as we've said in the past, the economy has grown by 0.3% or whatever, but also to add to that, say the economy has grown by 0.3 or whatever. Actually, in the process, we've destroyed another 0.2% asset base, so that the national accountants are thinking in net concepts is not to be underestimated. Next slide, please. Now, almost self-evidently, natural assets have environmental dimension as well as their interaction with the economy. So in the case of water, we have to be aware of what's going on in the environment itself, where the water is coming from, where it's being used, where it's seeping back into other environmental assets, and so on. That's the blue part of this diagram, but also to be aware of the brown part, which is the way that the economy is using water. Clearly, water is a key input not only for people, in terms of washing, drinking, bathing, all the things we do with water, but also for the economy itself in terms of being an input, a factor in production. So if you think of it in those terms, then what you immediately are drawn to the need for physical asset accounting, and we're going to account for these interactions. Some flow accounts, in particular supply and use tables, which I'll say a bit about in a moment, both in physical terms, where the water comes from, how it's being used, but also in monetary terms, what's the value of this water being used and where is it coming from. Valuation is a very important part of the project, and a very large part of what Paul Ekins talks about in the second half of the presentation. And then the ecosystem accounts themselves need to contain both the stock and flow dimension. How much water do we have? How is it being used? And actually another key part of the public debate is the need for water emissions accounts. How much pollutants are we actually emitting into water bodies in our economy or in our use of water? Next slide, please. In terms of the SEEA sequence of accounts here, these concepts we just talked about, I think, what's probably summarized by what we come to call the horseshoe diagram, a bit of a bent horseshoe, but it's a horseshoe in shape, as you can just about see. So we start on the left with stock accounts. In terms of how much water there is, what is the stock of water, the extent account, but also the condition account. What's the quality of that water? Is it polluted? Is it pure? Does it contain harmful? Well, those sort of issues. What's its quality? If we take the extent and the condition together, then we can move across to how is that producing a flow of useful services to humanity. That's the top right-hand side, but still at this stage in physical units. Now, at this stage, this is a key part of stitching these accounts to the national accounts, because we can start to think about this in terms of supply use tables. How much water is being supplied? How is it being used? And we can do that in physical unit terms, but if we're clever and we do the valuations properly, then we can think also in terms of the bottom right-hand side of the diagram, what is the value in monetary terms, in pounds, if you like, of these flows? And again, what does the supply use table in pounds look like? what's the value of the water being used, what's the value of the water being supplied, and where is it being supplied to. Then moving back to the left-hand side of the bottom, we can then capitalize these flows in monetary terms back into a stock by looking at the net present value of the current flow and future expected flows from this asset. And the very final part, not quite on the diagram, we can also deflate this to get back to a volume measure, but now a volume measure in constant price pounds rather than, as we started off, in physical units. Next slide, please. One of the issues with water, and indeed with any lithium asset, I suspect, is that once you start to think about the services that it provides, you very quickly get to a whole range of things that you can think of that water is useful for, the kind of services it provides. So one of the things we had to do fairly early on in the project is to think about what were the priority areas that we ought to be accounting for. We can't really account for 20 or so different environmental services water provides, ecosystem services water provides. And what we decided to concentrate on is, first of all, the provisioning services water provides, the water that's actually used by people and by industry as a useful input. We decided to concentrate on water purification services, going into flood protection as one of the elements of that. And then thirdly, recreational services. Water is not only a thing you drink and use and use in industry, but also a very important part is actually just the enjoyment value, the physical pleasure and benefits you get from being near to water. Whether that's water, that's a canal, river, lake, or whatever. And of course, a whole range of recreational activities, boating, fishing, walking outside the water goes with that. Next slide, please. Now, some of the biophysical ecosystem service initiatives and calculations that we've started to get into. Next slide. First of all, the UK is actually relatively well placed in this area, in the sense that a lot of work has been done and a lot of recognition given to the importance of natural capital, of accounting for it, for quite a few years. The National Ecosystem Assessment was published in 2011, and the Environment Act in the same year committed us to environmental accounting. One development from that was that in 2012, ONS itself started quite an extensive program of work to measure natural capital, following a request from the Natural Capital Committee. And I think 15 years on, that work has now shown up into some very substantial results which ONS has achieved and published. So we're starting off from quite a strong base. And actually, in that sense, because in many parts of the world, this initiative is, in a sense, rather newer, then it puts us, I think, quite a strong position to guide the way that this effort and work is taken forward into the future. Next slide, please. Now, this slide box is quite complicated, but actually they describe the way in which you need to start to think about measuring and accounting for these various stocks and flows that we talked about in the context of water. So both whether you're talking about accounting or whether you're talking about valuation, you need to map the physical processes involved, and then to get to grips with how you're going to measure and value those services. The bottom line for me from this slide is that if you're trying to engage in this endeavour, it's going to be almost absolutely needed that you have a multidisciplinary approach. Not only do you need economic input into this, statistical input, accounting input, but actually just as importantly, ecological and biophysical input. That's going to be absolutely necessary if this process if this valuation and accounting is going to be taken forward in a productive and sensible way. Next slide, please. So, we started to talk about how in physical accounting you would need to know about the ecosystem extent, how much water we have, and you know about its quality. And that would give us the ecosystem services flow. Next slide, please. I'm slightly, yes, that's better. So you start to get into what are these, what in specific terms would we need to do to establish accounting for extent and for condition. And you see some of the things here that you need to think about quite carefully in that context. Next step. Next step in the slide. And one of the things that I think is very, very important, which is occupied quite a bit of our time, is that you can find from land condition maps, from satellite information or whatever, what is the area of water in the UK. And of course, you also have to turn that into what is the volume. So is the river deep? Is it shallow? Is the lake deep? Is the lake shallow? What's the volume going with the actual physical extent of the water that you can measure from the surface? So that's one of the key issues in which we've done work. And I think with good results, not least by involving the UK Centre for Hydrology and Environment and Hydrology, UKCEH, with whom we've worked very successfully. Next slide again, please. Or next step in the slide. You can see the various issues that go with condition that we need to look at. Most of these are specified in general terms in the SEEA-EA itself, but these look like the sort of things that you would need to look at and measure if you're going to get a rounded and definitive account of what condition of water looks like. So you have a physical state, you have a chemical state, you have biotic ecosystem characteristics, so-called, and also landscape characteristics as well. What is the water? Is the water in a pleasant landscape? Is it harming the landscape? Is it helping the landscape? And again, please. And again. Then I think you can see that the ecosystem extent and the ecosystem condition is together giving us the ecosystem service flow. We then have the three the three ecosystem services we decided to prioritize: provisioning, purification, water-raised recreation. And you can see on the right-hand side the kind of areas where we found it appropriate, were found useful and interesting information, which has enabled us to start to account for and measure these various services. One thing you'll immediately see from the right-hand list is, again, a very good illustration of the way that multidisciplinary sourcing and working is needed. So one thing to get the abstraction statistics, for example, but if you're going to make much headway in accurately measuring purification issues, then you need a lot of hydrological information. And we've used a hydrological model working very successfully, as I said, with UKCEH for that purpose. In terms of recreation services, then, for example, the Natural England People Data Survey gives you a lot of information. We've also found the Canal River Trust to be a very important and useful source of information in that context. But as I say, I think the overall point from here is a very good illustration about how getting this information needs a multidisciplinary approach. Next slide, please. Just some estimates of the what we found about freshwater extent in the UK. The one I draw attention to is that the between the ONS estimates of freshwater wetlands and floodplains between 1990 and 2024 shows actually a significant increase over that period in the extent of the water. Next slide again, please. And this is the flow equivalent of that stock. How much provisioning, what is this flow of provisioning services being used? As you see, this has fallen over time. Indeed, that's a policy target. Whether it will continue to fall in the light of population growth is another interesting question for the future. But certainly that is what seems to have happened over the period up to the present. And I think the next and final slide in my part of the presentation, we managed to make some progress in working out where this provisioning was being used, which sectors were actually using this water. Don't be fooled by the fact that the total may not look entirely like the previous slide. The reason for that is that actually data limitations mean we've only been able to carry out this work so far up to 2018. So the falling total on the previous slide, we haven't been able to decompose because of data limitations. One final thing I'll say before handing over to Paul is that quite a few of the things I've talked about are hampered by the fact that data is often not easy to get. It's not that there's not data available, but there are a whole range of bodies with their fingers in the water pie. You have Environment Agency, you have DEFRA, you have the Drinking Water Inspectorate, you have the water companies, you have various water recreational bodies. All of them have a lot of data, but actually getting that data together is not always easy. And when you can get it together, then getting data harmonization by period or by definition is quite an intensive task. There is an industry initiative to get greater availability and greater harmonization of this dispersed data. And I think those of us who worked in the area would say only that can only come too soon. But I think that's my last slide. And before I hand over to Paul, who will deal with difficult issues.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. I'm not sure that the work that you've covered is easy, but certainly evaluation has its own particular problems. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of advice out there. So this on the right, you see a book which gives advice, and of course you get advice as well from the system environmental accounting documents themselves, provisioning services, regulation services, cultural services. That's Joe's already mentioned them. And one of the key issues to start with is that a lot of economic approaches for valuation give you what we call welfare values. In other words, the values that include consumer surplus. And the national accounts, as I'm sure everyone will know, is the figures in the national accounts are figures at market prices and exchange market prices, which are quite different from welfare values. And so if we are to have figures in the environmental side of the economic accounts that are comparable with those in the national accounts, and that of course is the idea, then we have to look for market values. And of course one of the big problems is that by and large there are not markets for a lot of the ecosystem services that we're looking for. So we have to use valuation methods, which I'll come into in a bit, which try to find exchange values rather than the welfare values, which techniques, for example, like willingness to pay and contingent valuation, don't deliver. They don't deliver market values. Next slide, please. And again, please. So what we can see is that for these values to mean anything, they've got to be carried out with quite a bit of rigor, and the SEEA ecosystem assessment, the SEEA ecosystem assessment, hedges its bets really against the various valuation methods and has produced a hierarchy without producing any particular recommendations as to the right method. Next slide, please. Oh, next part. That's what I wanted to see. So up at the top of the hierarchy, we've got the easy ones where actually the ecosystem service is immediately revealed in a market, or can be easily deduced from comparable markets for similar goods and services elsewhere. That's relatively rare, and we found that relatively rare with regard to water, so that we then have to move down the hierarchy to methods that are probably less satisfactory, but where we can actually get the exchange values that we're looking for. So you've got methods where the ecosystem service is embodied in a market transaction, and that might be a travel recreation study, for example, which is what we've done used in our work, or where it's based on revealed expenditures and costs for related goods and services, or where it's based on expected expenditure or markets or other valuation methods, which include the replacement cost for the ecosystem service if it were to be lost altogether. And in fact, it turns out that that's the most commonly used method because of the absence of any other kind of method. And I should also emphasize that what we're looking for is actually the valuation of the ecosystem service itself, and not of various value-adding activities that might have taken place in order to deliver the final product. So when we turn on a tap and get out drinking water, that obviously includes the ecosystem service that has provided the water in the first place, but a lot has been done to the water by the water supply companies in order to convert it into a drinking product and the infrastructure to deliver it to our homes. What we're looking for is the ecosystem service value. Next slide, please. So here is a list of the various valuation methods that may be used. So we can look at that central column, the resource rent, residual value, production function, hedonic pricing. This is all the stuff of environmental economics that people go through if they're learning that. We can work further down that column, averting behavior, replacement costs, avoided damage costs, and simulated exchange value. On the left, you've got the three basic kinds of ecosystem service, and how they are apparent. So where the service is embodied in the transaction, where the price of the ecosystem service is based on revealed expenditures, and where it's based on expected simulated expenditures. And on the right there, you've got the various kinds of ecosystem service that we're that we're seeking to get the valuations for: provisioning, regulation, or cultural. Next slide, please. And again. And again. And again. And I think that then fills in the boxes. So we've got three of the main methods there, where the ecosystem service is embodied in the market transaction, the resource rent and the residual value that is part of the final price that may be paid for water in this case, but for other ecosystem services too. Productivity change method, obviously if you've got irrigation and you're able to add water to agriculture, then you're going to increase the value there, and so that's kind of production function approach. And then with hedonic pricing, you're trying to look at other markets and see if you can identify the role of the ecosystem service in people enjoying those markets, and that again would be the travel cost method, or it may also be in the price of housing, for example, that is close to ecosystem services that people value. Next slide, please. and again, and again. So this is where it's revealed expenditures. We've got the travel cost method there again, and the averting behavior. So if you don't trust the water that comes out of the tap, and you are going to buy a water purifier, that is substituting for the natural water purification service that you might otherwise have been able to benefit from, and that shows that you are at least prepared to pay that market cost in order to do that. And with the travel cost method, similarly, widely used in welfare economics, and we have to try to use it in a way that gives us an exchange price of looking at what people are prepared to spend on travel in order to avail themselves of an ecosystem service, and that is particularly applied to recreation. Next slide, please. And again, and again, thank you. And then we can come to the ones that are most often used because of the inability to apply any of the other methods. The avoided damage costs. So if one is having to spend money in order to stop damage, so this is something that perhaps would be particularly applicable to flood management, where we put in place all sorts of infrastructure in order to stop flooding. That's something that could have been provided perhaps by nature, by hills and water storage options in nature, and it shows that we are at least valuing that to the amount that we're prepared to pay. And then we've got the replacement cost, whereby if, for example, we didn't have water that we wanted, we could desalinate seawater, and that would give us the fresh water that we want, but obviously through an engineered solution. Next slide, please. So this is a paper which we've drawn on quite heavily. Michael Varden is an academic who has written a lot on the valuing of water services and through the SEEA process. Next slide, please. And so in applying this to the UK in our project, we've been looking at these empirical applications of valuation methods from the literature, of which that paper was an example. There are not so many of them, and there are much fewer that actually try to get exchange prices rather than welfare costs. We look at the extent to which they are coherent and consistent with the accounting principles in the national accounts, but also in the system of environmental economic accounting, and we assess the feasibility of adopting these methods for the UK and our own water ecosystem service accounts. Next slide, please. And again, thank you. And there are really two ways of doing this. You can either look at the pyramid evaluation methods. You can look at how they've been applied, and we've got 3 references there and a couple of pictures that illustrate those examples. Or we can take a bottom-up approach and look at a systematic literature review, see how these various methods have been applied elsewhere, and then see whether those methods yield evaluations that we can apply in the UK. And in our work, we've tried to do a range of these different applications, as will become apparent. And next, please. So we've got some results. This is a result of work that was done by Victoria Reyes, and she did a systematic review and then a meta-analysis of the literature. And you can see on the bottom left there the various parts of the world to which that literature applied. You can see the kind of literature we're talking about. Was it an academic paper or was it a report? You could see down at the bottom right hand the categories of the water ecosystem services, and at the top right you can see that these studies have referred to 43 distinct water ecosystem ecosystem services. As Joe said, we've chosen 3 or 4 just to start off with, those that we thought were probably the most important and relevant in the UK context. And the number of studies that we did, forced used 33 is actually rather a small number. You can easily, in other issues, come up with hundreds or even thousands of studies. So this is not something that has yet been very widely applied in the academic literature or indeed in consultant reports. Next slide, please. And the next slide. So if we look at those pyramid levels, you can see where the sorts of methods fall into. The levels refer to the levels of the pyramid, and you can see level 1 was the easy ones, where we can actually get a market price directly from the literature or from the analysis from the ecosystem service itself, and then we work around, and you can see that level 5 is where most of those studies have been done, and those are basically the replacement cost studies. And similar story on the right there. You can see the valuation methods that have been applied: resource rent, productivity change, travel costs, diverting behavior, rather few there. Replacement cost, that's where most of the studies have come from. Avoided damage cost and simulated exchange value, also just a single study. Some of the studies, as I've stressed, that we're looking for exchange values if we can find them, but can't always find those. Some of them are welfare studies, and one has to pay great attention to see that, do the studies actually manage to isolate the value of the ecosystem service, or are they also including man-made capital costs and human labor costs, which is not really what we're wanting. And those costs, of course, are already in the system of national accounts. Those costs should be double counting. Next slide, please. Well, this is the ONS valuation of water provisioning using one of those methods, which is the resource rent method. On the left, you've got the valuation in millions of pounds, and on the right, you've got the valuation per cubic meter. And you can see that big problem with this method, which we're still trying to get to the bottom of in our project, that towards 2022, it suddenly takes a huge dive into negative territory. And obviously that doesn't make much sense, in the sense that the value of water provisioning, the ecosystem service value of water provisioning, couldn't possibly be negative, because water is something that we obviously need and value. So we're still trying to get to the bottom of precisely how that result has arisen, whether it's a fundamental flaw in the method, or whether it relates more to the way in which that method has been carried out. We rather hope it'll be the latter, because the resource rent method is the one that is often used for other natural capital accounts, particularly things like minerals and fossil fuels. Next slide, please. So that just gives the reference. Next slide. We've done 3 valuation mechanisms in doing this, and I say we, this is mainly Alice's work and Sylvia's work, and indeed Sylvia is the expert on valuation, who's provided the sort of base of our work here. And you can see that the values differ pretty dramatically. I said 3, I meant 4, because that orange line at the bottom is the value taken from abstraction prices. And abstraction prices only, we can only find those for a very small proportion of overall water use. And you can say that they produce very low prices. If we look at the top green line, that's the value transfer. I'm sorry, that's the replacement cost up at the top there. And you can see that desalination is a pretty expensive way. This is a replacement value by desalination equipment. And you can see desalination is a pretty expensive way of finding water. And the two in the middle are the resource rent, where we've cut that one off before it dives into negative territory, and the value transfer, the sort of pink line in the middle there, coming from the studies from elsewhere. So still lots of work to be done, because values that vary over that kind of range, which you can see on the right, it's not enormously useful for policy purposes. Next slide, please. So if we could just go through those conclusions very quickly to summarize both what Joe said and what I've said. We need both biophysical measurement and economic valuation. They both have their challenges, their data challenges and the valuation challenges. The area of freshwater wetlands and floodplains has increased over the 50 years that we have data for, and so has the flow in English rivers. Both overall and in each of the English regions, we are seeking to do this accounting with regional differentiation, because obviously water management is largely at a regional level. So there's little sign of reduced annual water availability, but of course annual averages can be pretty misleading. I mean, we've had over the last few weeks, we've had enormously high precipitation, which will, if we were now to go into a period of major drought, the annual average would probably still be very much unchanged. But given that we have had water shortages in the past, there are plans to build 10 new reservoirs by 2050 to ensure that those differences over the seasons can be ironed out by storage. Surface and tidal waters play a major role. Public water supply for the former and cooling power stations for the latter. We're actually using less water than we were, and that was shown in one of the graphs that Joe showed. But given that population is due to increase, and we can envisage that there will be periods where there is less water, there are targets to reduce water use further. The valuations in the water provision ecosystem service, they're problematic, and I've mentioned this negative value, which was shown up until in the 2 years 2022-23, and the replacement cost method, the one that we've applied at least, places a theoretical upper bound on the value. Abstraction prices give us the minimum value. And obviously the benefit transfer method is not specific to the UK because of the way in which that value has been generated, and that comes sort of more or less in the middle. I've said that the system of environmental economic accounting itself doesn't give definitive guidance as to how to value these ecosystem services, and this is a well understood kind of conundrum in environmental economics, that if you don't value them at all, you just stick to the biophysical numbers, then that gives them an implicit value of 0 because they can't get into the national accounts at all. And yet when we've using these valuation methods for water provisioning, at least, we get such a wide range of numbers that it's very difficult to have conviction in any of them. So this is a task for the future, and I think that it's something that SEEA itself, the system of environmental economic accounting itself, and the people who seek to apply it, we are going to have to arrive at some definitive conclusions about this, if indeed environmental economic accounting is to take its place with the same kind of rigor that we expect from the national accounts more generally. So that's it. Very much looking forward to what our discussant has to say, and perhaps we could turn over to Ian Dickey now.
Yeah, thank you, Joe and Paul. Very clear presentations, and over to Ian Dickey right away.
Thank you very much, Paul and Joe, for those presentations and the opportunity to speak today. Yeah, my name is Ian Dickey. I'm a director of economics for the Environment Consultancy. I should say I'm also a member of the UK Climate Change Adaptation Committee, but I'm speaking today as a director of FTech and not representing the views of the Climate Change Committee. So the first thing I'd like to say is that, yeah, I think these accounting structures are great and they're really worth putting the effort into that you've seen in the detailed work that's just been presented. And to reiterate Joe's point that it's essential accounting is a multidisciplinary exercise that takes extra effort, but it's worth doing and getting the systems right, because setting them up well so that they can be used consistently over time is where a lot of the benefits they'll provide lie. And so, for example, tracking the physical data on water consumption, as was mentioned, there's a policy target with that, but that's also a really key climate adaptation issue. And measuring them well in accounts not just tells you, what's happening with the headline figure, but with consistent measurement helps you unpick that. So are the reasons for the change that consumption is going down per capita, or that population is shifting, or some other reason? And so accounting systems will help us understand that. And that trusted time series of data, as I said, is really important. So if you look at this data and think, well, as a snapshot, that's interesting, I'm not sure it's worth the effort. That's because the real benefit comes from having a consistent time series, which obviously is what national statistics are about. Yeah, the data point I'd like to touch on to say that I think, yeah, an awful lot of that data is being collected by public bodies or on behalf of water customers, which basically means it's being done on behalf of the whole population, with resources that we provide, we pay for in the end. And so better sharing of data should really be a norm. And as was said, that can't change quickly enough. And we just can also think more widely about how this data is going to be used. So there's quite a lot of data issues highlighted in the IPBES report on business and biodiversity assessment released this week from the meetings in Manchester, and highlights the important trends in habitats and ecosystems over time. And so linking those to water consumption, as was discussed in the data, is really important. It has those wider uses to inform lots of policy decisions, some of which we're not yet aware of, and lots of which we're putting increasing effort into understanding. So there will be a well-adapted UK report and a UK climate change risk assessment being published on the 20th of May, and their water consumption is a key issue for both those things, with the risks that climate change pose and how we should adapt to it. Yeah, then going on to the valuation points. The value is really important to try and understand, because it tells us about the relationship between demand and supply. So not just what ecosystems can provide, but where we want to consume it and where it has most value to us. There are still challenges involved that Paul laid out very clearly. But actually, I would say that it's worth doing multiple methods, and they tell you different things, and the comparison of them tells you further information. So that's worth doing. And yes, the SEEA prioritise exchange values for good reason, as was said, to compare to the SNA. But the thing I think is that can be done now to make best use of those values is firstly that the people doing natural capital accounts need to frame and communicate what the values represent, which usually means presenting the monetary data alongside the physical data that they represent, and how they've been produced. And then users of that data need to become savvy to ask for those explanations. So if you're presented with monetary values about the environment from anywhere, but particularly from an accounting process, then there should be an explanation of the basis on which it's calculated, what that value represents. And if that's not there, you should ask for it. It's not your job to lay out how to do that. That should be done by the people producing the accounts. But users need to question, what values represent, and be aware that there's more than one way of valuing the environment. And that's really important, because actually just looking at a change in value can hide what's going on. So a value may go up because there's more scarcity of the environmental good or the ecosystem service in question, or it may go up because there are more people benefiting from it. And the policy response to those changes would be very different. So that's why an accounting structure that has the underlying data and helps you understand that is really important. Very interesting to see the results on the resource rent method. I understand its attractiveness in an accounting sense, that it has a logic to it, but I also have a methodological sort of question with it, really, that I feel that the value of an ecosystem service may be embedded in the other forms of capital that are used to exploit it, and then those other capital values are deducted from the overall value of the resource in order to isolate the environmental value. And so there's some kind of logical problem with doing that. So away from water, the example I'd give is with a healthy soil resource is valuable for agricultural production. That's why a farmer can buy a more expensive tractor. But then in the resource rent method, you deduct some of the depreciation of that tractor as capital from the value of the soil. But the tractor's only been bought because the soil's healthy. So there's a bit of a sort of environment coming second in that equation that is one of the reasons why it may throw up negative values. And it does that in other sectors too, for example, with fisheries. But we'll get richer value evidence from having both welfare values and exchange values about the environment and understanding how they're generated and comparing them. And then presenting those, as I said, with the physical data that represents the environment. And that'll give the richer set of data to be able to support good decisions. And having the logic of how those are produced in that water resource economy diagram is really important to have as a basis for that. And then ultimately we can make better economic decisions. Water is a really important resource for our economy as well as environmental decisions, and those things should be informed by the same data to improve how we manage the environment and our economy. And thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak to you all, and I hope we can answer some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. We do have a few minutes left for questions and answers. I might encourage the audience to put them in the chat box. That may be easiest. Maybe while people think Joe or Paul may want to come back to one or two of the points that Ian mentioned, like on the resource rents, some of the value being incorporated in other capital, or on the fact that maybe having different valuation results is not such a bad thing because they just enrich the story. Paul or Joe, would you like to comment?
Yes, I'm happy to come back. I mean, I think Ian's explanation as to why you sometimes get these negative values is undoubtedly right. The question is that if they were to appear in national accounts, people would think this was very odd, because it would suddenly look as if not only was the environment not worth anything, or water not worth anything, it actually had a negative value, which is intuitively obviously nonsensical. And so I think one will need to look in each case where you get those kinds of results, precisely what it is that is delivering the result. Is it that there's been very heavy capital expenditure and that's now being depreciated, and is that being done in a sensible way? Is it that you are giving a particular sector a large subsidy, which may also result in a negative value? And that, of course, is a political decision in order to keep down the cost of something that is regarded as being of fundamental importance. But in the way in which the resource rent is calculated, that may make it seem as if the actual resource itself has a negative value. And of course, that's not sensible either. So I think the thing I take away mainly from what Ian said about these things is that you've got to dig down into them and see exactly what the number is representing. And I think in the four methods that I presented, you can see that the number is actually representing different things in each case. And that once you understand that it's representing different things, it can make sense. But that means that you haven't got a single answer to the question of what is the value of the ecosystem of water provisioning, ecosystem service of water provisioning. And that's rather unsatisfactory, in that we would very much like to have a single value of that. But these different methods are almost certain to throw up different values, as we've seen in this case.
Thank you, Paul. I don't see any comments in the chat for others. Someone who has raised her or his hand. Would you like to come in, please? I only can see your acronyms SM, so please speak up.
Hi, Paul. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thanks, Ian, Joe, and Paul for your presentation and the discussant presentation. Very quickly, I just want to pick up on Paul's point. I agree. you can have a negative resource flowing and it can have a meaning. But here, I think it's probably a statistical quirk that we need to pin down what's driving it, because it's so sudden. Because even if you were investing heavily through capital formation, the depreciation will not be creating such a change. It will be over many years. Because when you're thinking about the assets of flood protection, renewals of pipes, etc., this is capital formation, have a life length of a long time. So I agree that needs investigation. Question for Paul and Joe in a way was, when you put your tables together, for me, it's a very powerful feedback loop for the monetary and physical tables in current prices and in volume terms back in the flow. So I don't know if you identified any quirks that needed to be followed up, because obviously you're assuming your starting point is correct. You're assuming, but more data, a bigger, wider framework challenges that assumption. So I was wondering if there's anything you identified. Obviously, you've only gone back to the late 90s. Do you have plans to go back any further? That's an easier question. Then I have a quandary. The stock of water, with the ice caps melting, and we're hearing about centimetres, inches increases to the water levels around the world, and obviously we're surrounded by water in the UK. At the same time as water usage with cooling servers and AI, etc., we're going to get some very different quandaries coming along to challenge some of our assumptions like future asset life lengths and discounting future flows. Any thoughts on those type of issues? And my final point, I'm less worried about what you're saying, Paul, double counting, because I don't see it as such. So the investment in flood protection, replacing historical pipes, extending the life lengths, etc., they're supporting the ecosystem. So it's not a case of whether it's in the national accounts or not, it's whether you need that investment to support an ecosystem. So I view that slightly differently. Thanks.
Thank you, Sanjeev. In the interest of time, I will ask Viveka to come in right away before handing back to the authors. Viveka, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the seminar. It's very interesting. I wanted to say, and I actually put it in the chat at the same time, that we see these types of evaluations in traffic planning, and there I think they make sense because they are sort of comparing different measures, what to do to save more lives or to have a better traffic system. There, everyone that sort of deals with them knows what they represent. But I think that a national system like the national accounts or the SEEA has problems to sort of do these things that are quite context specific in a way so that people would actually, I mean, it would be very hard for us to explain what they mean to all the people who need to do something with water. I mean, there's like 8 different UN agencies dealing with water. We've seen it in the Sustainable Development Goals that there are so many different issues that come in, so many choices and so many different discussions. I think it's really hard for us to sort of meet all that demand and provide context. Thank you. That was just a comment.
Thank you, Viveka. And the final comment I'd like to bring in is from Richard, and then I will turn back.
Thank you. Now, I was just going to reflect on something Ian said. I mean, I think the great tension with the SEEA is the attempt to use market prices for natural capital, natural resources, which by sort of design are the things which are market price low, externality high, and particularly where that externality could be absorbed within other market prices presents a real challenge. For me also, market prices, the S&A is based off a concept of a competitive market, and particularly in a regulated market like water, where the regulator is going to be setting a price based on the cost of capital. You know, the water is free to the water company in a sense to absorb into their process to clean it and to distribute it. So by design, almost that regulated price should set the resource rent to zero. And I'm wondering if that may be part of the issue that you're hitting here. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Let me now turn back to Paul, Joe, or Ian, whoever wants to react.
Could I just come in that case
Please.
to reflect on one thing that Sanjeev said and one thing that Richard said. Sanjeev made a number of points, so I can try to cover more of them, but the point that did strike me is that we have a sequence of accounts defined by the SEEA, and clearly the first task is to actually compile that sequence of accounts. But I think he's quite right that having done that, then you shouldn't regard these as just being purely sequential, but actually you need to look at them together to see whether actually there is implications from the later accounts which suggest that some of the earlier accounts in the sequence may need further attention. So I think that is to be done, but it's probably a little way down the road yet until we've actually first of all got the first sequence of accounts in place and compiled. And the point I was going to make about Richard's point is there's a bit of a danger of over assuming how effective the exchange values used in national accounts are. For a start, 30% of GDP is covered in non-market environments where you have to think about, where you have to find other ways of imputing the price, and public services and various imputed items. But actually, even in the 70% of the economy where that is not the case, the market sector, the vast majority of those sectors are heavily regulated and are certainly subject to imperfect competition. So this sort of underlying thesis in national accounting that perfect competition reigns, and indeed that there are constant returns to scale, they really are fictions. So I'm not too fussed about the idea of using regulated prices in this context, except if we think the regulation is so severe as to get something which is completely out of track with what the real exchange value would be.
Paul, would you also want to?
Yes, a couple of quick things. I mean, I think I mentioned this conundrum that what the SEEA, the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, what it has been invented to address is the fact that routinely economic decision making proceeds by allocating a value of 0 to many environmental issues, which on inspection turn out to be very important. And I think there are two ways of trying to deal with that. I mean, one is environmental targets that have to be met in their own right, but then you have the problem that requires resources, and how do you know that you ought to be meeting those environmental targets with those resources rather than spending them on something else? And Viveca's point about traffic planning is very comparable in that respect. On the other hand, when you try to treat environmental resources that are not straight commodities, i.e. ecosystem services, when you try to treat them as if they were and try to find market prices, well, we get the sorts of issues that are raised that we've got. Sanjeev asked, were there other quirks that we discovered? I think we're going to have to take that offline, Sanjeev, with the rest of the team as well to actually answer that question. But obviously with water, climate change is going to fundamentally change over the years to come. The whole profile of water. I mean, I'm not so worried about the sea level rise, except insofar as the flood management issues will concern. But what it will change is the quantity of fresh water, because we know a warmer atmosphere will contain much more fresh water than a cooler atmosphere, and that fresh water will be dumped in different kinds of quantities than we're used to, both in terms of too much and too little, because of the way in which weather patterns change. And I think having a really good grip on water resources at a regional level is going to be a very, very important thing that we currently don't really have. And obviously the first stage of the biophysical accounting of water can help with that. And then moving to the valuation, obviously that can be important just to express that the value is not 0 and that we need to take it into account. So those are some of my thoughts in response to the very interesting points raised.
Excellent, thank you. I'm conscious of time. I saw that Ian has put some reactions in the chat box. Is there anything in addition that you would like to bring in?
Well, if I could just reflect as a final point, and yeah, thanks for all the questions from people. Yeah, the challenges we've discussed are not insignificant, but also the benefits that this data can bring are not insignificant. So it's important we keep pursuing these things. Some really good examples have been given on climate change. Also, I'd say things like the Global Biodiversity Framework has the objectives about health of ecosystems. We don't have a way of connecting that to how our economy performs and our quality of life. And these accounting systems are taking us to be able to do that. And yeah, that's a really important thing to establish.
Thank you, Ian. I think those were excellent words also by way of concluding this webinar, which means all that is left for me is thanking Joe, Paul, yourself, and of course the teams who have been working on these topics for their very interesting contributions, all the participants for joining in and showing interest in these topics. And so let me wish you a good rest of the day and see you again at some other ESCoE seminar. Thank you very much.